Hello everyone, Katarina here, welcome back. In today's video I'm going to be creating autumnal cards and I will be using the Brusho powders that I bought at the beginning of the summer. They are watercolors in a powder version. I wanted to get these powders for a very long time, and after Nuvo released the shimmer powders, which I will be using probably on Christmas cards, I decided to also get the Brusho powders. And I can tell you I love these. And in this video, I will be showing you 3 ways of using them. So let's get started. So the set I got has 12 colors, but on the leaflet that comes in the box, there are way more colors. But I think that the set of 12 is enough. Although I do think they could have added pink instead of the 2 yellows. The powders come in these little jars and I already did few things. First, I created swatches, nothing special, only as a color reference, and I adhered it on the lid inside of the box. You can see on the swatches how pigmented these powders are. And other thing I did is to pierce the lids of the jars. I took my piercing tool and I pierced the lid 3 times. You can pierce the bottle only once, depending how thick your piercing tool is. I remembered that other crafters did this, and it makes sense. You don't need too much powder to create bold colors, and I found it difficult to open the bottles anyway. There are many ways of using these powders, and I will be showing you 3 ways of using them. First technique, not sure how would you call it, I decided to call it a dry to wet technique, where you add the powders on a dry cardstock and spray it with water. I will be creating a watercolor background and I will be using the Autumn Flower stamp set from Clearly Besotted. This is an older stamp set. Actually, all the stamp sets I will be using in this video are older stamp sets. All of them are from Clearly Besotted. I'm not sure if they are still available, but if I find some alternatives, I will include them in the supply list below this video. I have actually never created autumnal cards, and when I was shopping at Clearly Besotted last March, I decided to buy this stamp set with the leaves. I wanted to have the leaves across the whole panel and heat emboss them with a white embossing powder. I decided to stamp and heat emboss first and then add the Brusho powders. But you can also do it the other way, first create a background with the Brusho powders and then heat emboss. I used my Mini Misty stamping tool just in case I need to restamp. For all the cards you see today, I use the hot press watercolor cardstock, which has a smooth surface and it's very good for stamping. I treated the cardstock with an anti-static powder tool to make sure that the powder doesn't stick where it's not supposed to. It doesn't prevent the powder sticking all the time, but it does help. Then I inked the stamps with the Versamark ink and then I pressed it down onto my background. I did this twice just to make sure I applied the ink properly. Next I applied the white embossing powder. This embossing powder is from Stampendous, but you can use any powder you have in your stash. I think golden embossing powder would also look great. I used my heat tool to heat set the powder until it melted. And because this is a small stamp set and it doesn't fill the whole background at once, I repositioned the stamps and repeated the whole process. Anti-static powder, Versamark ink, embossing powder, and then I melted it with my heat tool. I will skip the part with the rest of the stamping and heat embossing because it's the same process. Let's start with the watercoloring. I attached the panel with the heat embossed leaves on a board. I used a washi tape to attach it so it doesn't warp once the water is applied. Then I took out the powders. I wanted to use red, yellow, orange and green. I sprinkled the powders across the panel just randomly. I didn't have any exact idea in my mind how to spread the colors around. Remember, the powders are highly saturated and a little powder goes a long way. The green and the yellow powders look pretty much the same before you add the water, which is good to keep in mind if you do not want to mix them up. I took my spray bottle, this one I bought in a drugstore, and I sprayed the panel. I was very generous with the water. I wanted the powders to mix with the water properly. You can also use a brush to help it spread around. But this is what I love about the powders when creating the backgrounds. Just put some colors together and let the water do the work. I was almost happy with the result, but I thought the background was too yellow, so I sprinkled a little bit of red and green and sprayed it with water one more time. I used a dry brush to absorb some of the water and I let it air dry. I do this most of the time with my cards when I watercolor. I just prefer when it air dries rather than using a heat gun. Either I just leave it overnight to dry or I dry it for a few hours while I'm doing something else. And the something else was creating another card. Creating the backgrounds was the reason why I bought this stamp set, so let's give it another try. I decided to change up the stamping a bit. I stamped the leaves along the edges while leaving the middle empty. I didn't tape the panel because when I was stamping the leaves, I didn't think about I will need to tape it. It doesn't matter, but having it taped down, it would prevent the warping. Again, I sprinkled the powders on top of the panel. Then I took my spray bottle and I sprayed the panel, making sure I dissolve all the powder. Because of the warping, the water started pooling. Not a big deal, I took a paper towel again to absorb the water and I used a dry brush to move the water a bit. I let it dry for a bit and started working on the sentiment. I will show you how I finished the cards at the end, but this video is mainly how you can use the Brusho powders. So let's start with the technique number 2, which is dry on wet technique. That means I added the water first and then the powders. You can create a background with this technique as well, but since I already showed you how to create a background, I decided to use this sunflower from another stamp set from Clearly Besotted called Sunshine and Smiles, and I will be doing sort of a messy watercoloring. I picked the colors I will be using. I will be using the yellow, green, and brown. I stamped the flower onto a watercolor cardstock using the Versafine ink in Onyx Black, which is a great ink when you're using watercolors. I stamped it twice to have nice black outlines. So my first attempt using this stamp was the first technique, dry to wet technique, and it turned out like this. I kind of like it, but it's not what I was going for. I wanted to create a messy look, but I just wanted to have the colors slightly outside of the lines, not all over the place, and I didn't want them to be mixing together. That's why I decided to add the water first and only to the areas I wanted the color to go. Because the brown was in the middle, I first did the normal watercoloring. I added the brown powder into a palette and colored the middle. Since it's a small section of the flowers, I used a heat tool to dry it so it doesn't mix with the other colors. Then I applied a clean water on the leaves. And as I said, going slightly outside of the lines, I sprinkled the powder on top of the leaves. I had to use a brush to help the powders to spread around. I also added a little bit more powder in between, and when I was happy with the look, I let it dry. And then I did the same with the petals on the flower. I applied the water first and then I sprinkled the yellow powder and used my brush to spread it around and let it dry. The last technique I want to show you is just a simple watercoloring. You already saw it a little bit when I was coloring the middle of the sunflower with the brown color. I will be using here another stamp set from Clearly Besotted with another sunflower. It's called Sending Sunshine. Again, I stamped the flower with the Versafine ink in Onyx Black. I let it dry for a few minutes to be sure that the ink is dry and will not mix with the watercolors. This is a big stamp set, so I had to stamp it 3 times to get even outlines. I used again yellow, green and brown colors for the sunflowers, and for the little flowers in the back I picked blue. I took my mixing palette and I sprinkled the powders into the wells. As I mentioned earlier, the colors are quite saturated and you don't need to use too much powder, but some of the colors needed a refilling. Then I sprayed a little bit of water to each well and started with the coloring. The coloring is exactly the same as you would do with traditional watercolors. I was using 2 brushes, one to apply the color and one clean brush to spread the color around. I will not show you all the coloring because there are parts I put my head directly in front of the camera, making the footage completely useless, so I cut those parts out. Also, it took me quite some time to finish up the coloring because I was adding multiple layers of the color as the flowers looked a little bit flat, but I still want to show you some of the coloring, so I will just speed it up and I will show you condensed version of my coloring. To finish up the cards, I will get quickly through this so the video is not too long. For all the card bases, I used a Kraft cardstock and I adhere the panels on top of it using a foam tape. Also on all the cards, I used the gold Gonzai Tambi watercolors from Kuretake to add some golden splatter across the cards. Except of the last card, all the panels I die cut using the stitched rectangular die from Create a Smile. And except of the second card, all sentiments I used were from the same stamp set as the main image. On the first card, I heat embossed the sentiment using a white embossing powder. The sentiment says, "Thank you so much." I trimmed the sentiment into a banner and cut the right side of the banner at an angle. The left side of the banner, to match the stitching effect on the panel, I used a stitched border die from Lawn Fawn. To adhere the banner, I used a foam tape and I attached it on the left side of the panel. On the second card, I used the thank you sentiment from the brushed greetings from Clearly Besotted. I used it in the middle of the panel using the Versafine ink in Onyx Black, and I heat embossed it with a clear embossing powder. For the third card, with a single sunflower, I decided to stamp the sentiment directly across the bottom of the flower. I used the stamps that say "You are" and "Sunshine" to create the sentiment "You are my sunshine," and I stamped it again with the Versafine ink in Onyx Black. And for the last card, I used the sentiment "Birthday Wishes," but as I mentioned earlier, I could not use the stitched rectangular die because it would not fit, because I stamped it on a wrong angle. If I angled it a little bit differently, then it would fit. I could have adhered the whole panel on top of the card base. Maybe adding black stitched lines along the panel would help, but I decided to trim the sides without trimming the flowers. I didn't do a good job on this one. I must have moved the cardstock when trimming it down and it was a little bit uneven. I tried to correct it with my craft knife. It helped a little bit, but I can see the imperfection. It's not a big deal, the card looks fine and I'm sure someone who will get this card will appreciate it, but I still see that it's a little bit uneven. Lastly, after I adhered all the panels on top of the card bases, I also added few sequins on top of the cards with the sunflowers. So this finishes the cards for today. The video is a little bit longer than I usually do, but I made 4 cards in this video using the Brusho powders, showing you 3 different techniques. My favorite is still the one with the background. It's just fun to watch how the colors mix together. I hope you liked this video. If you did, make sure you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you are new to my channel. This way you don't miss any of my future videos. You can follow me on Instagram and Pinterest and check out my blog where I have photos of the cards and often I include more information. Thank you all so much for watching and I will see you next time. Bye!